Berlin, November 1989. Midnight. My hands shook from the heat of the furnace as we fed file after file into the flames. The room was packed with agents in silence, sweat dripping, papers curling into ash before they even touched the fire. Outside, you could hear the roar of the wall breaking apart, but inside we were tearing down something else, faster, quieter, and with no witnesses. Guards slammed the steel door shut, and the air turned heavy with smoke and panic. Someone coughed, someone cursed, and then nothing but the sound of secrets dying one page at a time. I looked at the stack still in my arms. One folder slid loose, the corner burning, the ink twisting as if it wanted to speak before disappearing. I froze, and that was the moment everything changed. If you're still here, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. Berlin, 1989. The Dahlen station looked like a warehouse more than an outpost. Gray walls, filing cabinets stacked like tombstones, and a furnace that had never been used for anything larger than shredded memos. That night, it glowed like a beast. Orders came at dusk. Burn everything, no exceptions. We didn't ask why. In that world, asking why was a good way to be reassigned or erased. I stood shoulder to shoulder with men I'd known for years, all of us in silence. The first stack went in easy. Codebooks, wiretap logs, photographs. The fire snapped and hissed, sparks licking the ceiling. I kept thinking, this wasn't just about protecting identities. Too much weight in those boxes. Too much history. My gloves stuck with sweat and ash, and every page I threw in felt like burying a person I'd once known. The furnace wasn't big enough for the panic in the room. We dragged metal bins closer, feeding them like livestock, and the station filled with smoke. Some laughed nervously, as if it were a drill. Others looked pale, waiting for a reason to stop. Midnight ticked by, and still the pile didn't shrink. The flames swallowed it, but there was always more lists, transcripts, reports stamped with red ink that meant nothing outside these walls. I caught myself staring at a single folder on top of the stack, thick, heavier than the rest, marked, with numbers instead of names. My hand hesitated. That pause drew a glare from the supervisor, who barked, "Move it." I dropped it into the fire and listened to the crackle, as if it could tell me what I'd just erased. For the first time, I realized I didn't want to know. The floor turned slick with ash, gray footprints marking every step. We worked faster, mechanical, like a factory line. Someone made a joke about how Moscow would kill for the smoke rising from our chimney. No one laughed. It was too close to the truth. At some point, I lost count of the files. All I remember is the heat intolerable, relentless. My eyes watered, but I kept feeding the flames. We all did dot, and then it happened. A folder stuck to my glove. The paper fused to the leather by sweat and ash. I pulled it free, but instead of tossing it, I slipped it inside my coat. Instinct, not decision. No one noticed. Or if they did, they pretended otherwise. That's how survival worked back then. Don't see, don't tell. By dawn, the room was empty. Cabinets stood open, hollow, like bodies stripped of organs. The furnace still smoldered, the last curls of smoke drifting like ghosts. We left without ceremony, each man walking into the cold Berlin air as if he'd just done a night shift at the factory. No handshakes, no goodbyes. Just silence. I should have forgotten it all there. Let the smoke carry the memory into the sky with the rest of it. But I didn't, because of that one folder pressed against my chest. That should have been the end of it. But years later, when I finally opened what I'd saved, I realized it was only the beginning. I didn't look at it right away. The folder sat hidden for weeks, then months, folded inside an old leather case I carried home after Berlin. Retirement came soon after, and with it, The kind of silence that makes you think about what you've done and what you've ignored. Most men drank their way through it. I tried that too. But the folder marked only with a faded stamp, 47B, kept nagging at me from the bottom drawer. The day I finally opened, it was nothing special. Rain hit the windows, the kind of steady drizzle that turns the world gray. I poured a whiskey, sat down at the kitchen table, and slid the pages out. My hands didn't shake, but my stomach tightened like it knew something I didn't. The first sheet was a cover page. Routine clearance stamps, signatures in ink I recognized but couldn't place. Then came the reports. The contents weren't in order. Some pages looked copied too many times, edges warped, words blurred. Others were crisp, like they'd been retyped yesterday. A name kept surfacing in the paragraphs, Sniper. At first, I thought it was a code name for a weapon system or an operation. But the context gave it away, references to meetings, payments, double reports filed from Warsaw and Moscow. Sniper wasn't a project. He was a man. One detail hit harder than the rest, cross assignments. Pages showed him listed under both CIA and KGB, as if someone couldn't decide who owned him. I'd heard rumors of such things back then, but to see it in writing, our own records admitting it, was another matter. He wasn't just playing both sides. He was authorized to. I read on, line after line, until I reached a section marked Berlin, 1965. My chest went tight. I had been there then. A reception, a handoff, a man I barely remembered shaking hands with in a crowded hallway. The report described the same night, the same setting, only the man was given the code name Sniper. I'd met him, blind to who he was, and walked away thinking nothing of it. The more I read, the stranger it felt. The documents weren't warning us about him, they were protecting him. Notes about strategic tolerance, useful ambiguity, phrases that meant someone high up had decided it was better not to know the full truth. I felt the whiskey turn bitter in my mouth. We'd burned so much that night in Dahlem, and this was what slipped through the flames. By the time I reached the bottom of the stack, the rain had stopped. The room smelled of damp paper and cheap liquor. I sat there staring at the last page, a summary half-redacted, ending with the words status unresolved. No closure, no confirmation. Just that phrase. I folded the papers back into the folder and pressed it flat against the table. My reflection stared back from the slick cover. Older, lined, a man I barely recognized. That file had survived because of me, by accident, by instinct, by something I couldn't explain. And now it was mine to carry. I thought burning it would end the weight. But instead, keeping it alive meant I'd have to live with the questions. And questions, in this business, were heavier than answers. That should have been the moment I tossed it in the fireplace. Instead, I poured another drink and read it again, slower this time, because some part of me wanted the ghosts to stay. The file said Warsaw, 1965. I remember it like a postcard smudged at the edges. I'd been dispatched for a routine liaison. Assignment, nothing dramatic, meet, greet, hand over a sealed pouch, and fly back to Berlin. No questions. That was the rhythm then. Small errands that meant nothing, until you realized years later they'd been the scaffolding for something much bigger. The reception hall was smoky, crowded with faces blurred by cheap vodka and cheaper perfume. Local dignitaries, trade officials, a sprinkling of diplomats, all smiling like masks. I stood near the wall, watching the room as instructed. That's when I noticed him, a man in his 40s, neat haircut, posture straight but not stiff, the kind of presence that draws attention without asking for it. He approached, shook my hand, said something polite about the weather. His English was flawless, but carried a rhythm I couldn't place. Back then, I filed him away as just another contact. A nobody, but the folder called him Sniper, the double agent, the one playing both Moscow and Langley. Reading that decades later made me realize that Handshake wasn't small at all. It was the hinge on a door I hadn't known existed. Remember a flicker that night, a subtle look he gave me when I passed him the sealed pouch. Not suspicion, recognition, as if he knew more about me than I did about him. I brushed it off that the time agents saw ghosts everywhere in those days. But the file confirmed it. He wasn't just another suit at the table. He was already reporting on me, on all of us, to 2 different masters. The strange part? The reports weren't hostile. He wasn't burning us, not entirely. His notes read like a careful balancing act, feeding Moscow enough to keep his cover, giving us just enough to keep our trust. I could almost hear his voice in the pages, calm, calculated, detached. What unsettled me most wasn't that he was a traitor. It was that he wasn't. He was loyal, but to what? I couldn't say. A man like that doesn't survive by chance. Someone had sanctioned his existence. Someone had decided that having a ghost in the system was better than trying to exorcise it. I closed my eyes and pictured his face in that hall. Clear eyes, faint smile, no hint of fear. He shook my hand, like he knew exactly where it would all lead that one day. Decades later, I'd be sitting in my kitchen with his files spread before me, realizing I had been a piece on his board. The rain outside that night in Warsaw had turned the cobblestones slick. I remember slipping a little as I left the hall, clutching the pouch, thinking it was just another day done. I didn't know I was already part of Sniper's story, and maybe he was already part of mine. That should have been nothing more than a forgotten handshake in a foreign city. But when I saw his name tied to operations I'd lived through, it wasn't the handshake I remembered. It was the look. And the look told me this wasn't coincidence. Her name never appeared in the clear. Always the asset, the contact, the courier. The file described her as a secretary stationed in East Berlin, tied to Sniper through routine transfers of information. Nothing unusual about that. Berlin was full of secretaries who knew more than generals. What unsettled me was the contradiction. The reports placed her death in 1965, yet I remembered her alive. It was winter, sometime after the Warsaw trip. I was back in West Berlin, ducking into a small cafe near Kurfürstendamm. The cold had driven everyone inside, coats draped over chairs, the smell of burnt coffee and wet wool clinging to the air. I noticed her as soon as I stepped in. White, coat, hair pinned back, the kind of presence that stands out even when someone's trying not to. She was alone, stirring a cup that had gone cold. I didn't approach her. I didn't have to. She looked straight at me, and for a second I felt the same recognition I'd seen in Sniper's eyes. Not fear, not surprise, recognition. I ordered coffee, pretended not to notice, but my hand stayed tense on the cup. When I finally turned back, she was gone. Coat, cup, everything like she hadn't been there at all. The contradiction ate at me years. Later, when the file confirmed what my gut already knew, someone had falsified her death. The report even listed the place, terminated in Prague. I never worked Prague, never asked. But the certainty in that line, written as if it were unquestionable, clashed with the memory of her eyes on me across that cafe table. Why lie? About her? Why keep her ghost alive in documents while erasing her from the living? If Sniper was a shadow straddling 2 empires, she was the smoke that told you the fire was real. The file had photographs, grainy surveillance shots, blurred angles. But even blurred, I knew it was her. That coat, that face, the same one that shouldn't have been there after she'd supposedly died. The strange part is, I never saw her again. Not in person, not in another report. Just those few pages, looping her presence through operations I wasn't part of, tying her back to Sniper in ways that didn't make sense. She was either a ghost the agency invented to justify movements, or she had been playing a longer game than anyone else. When I closed the folder that night, I realized I hadn't been thinking about her as an operative. I'd been remembering her as a person in a cafe, staring into a cup she never drank from. That image stayed sharper than any file photo. And if she had recognized me, really recognized me, then I had been in deeper than I ever imagined, long before I knew what I was carrying. That should have been the last time her face crossed my mind. But the file made sure it wouldn't be. The file had a gap, not a missing page in absence, like something that had never been finished. It referenced a transmission, one I suddenly remembered from years earlier. A coded message picked up on, a frequency we barely used, logged as pending decryption. Back then, it was routine. Half the chatter we intercepted went into storage, flagged for later. Later rarely came. I recalled the night. Berlin, late autumn, 1971. The station's listening post was cramped, lined with machines that hummed like angry insects. A young operator flagged the transmission short, clipped, almost panicked. We logged it, passed it up, and went back to the usual work. The order was always the same. Record, report, forget. But I remembered because the operator muttered, "This one feels different." He wasn't wrong. In the file, the line of text was chillingly simple. Content, warning, compromised asset within station, identity pending. That was it. No follow-up, no appendix, no cross-reference. Just a note that the transmission was never decoded, never pursued, buried under thousands of pages, lost in the tide of paperwork. Until now, I stared at those words and felt the weight of years collapse into one room, one night. If that warning had been real, someone inside Dahlem had been playing both sides. Maybe more than one. The suicide of the technician in 72 suddenly didn't look like guilt. It looked like a cover. He had taken the blame, and the file quietly confirmed what no one wanted to admit. We'd been watching the wrong man. The silence in those rooms comes back to me more vividly than the noise. We thought we were in control, cataloging Soviet moves, building profiles, predicting strikes. But here was proof that someone had been sitting at the same tables, wearing the same badge, and smiling back at us while they fed Moscow what they wanted. I lit a cigarette, even though I'd quit years earlier, and kept reading the same line. Identity pending. My reflection in the smoke looked like a stranger. Who had known, and who had decided not to act? That wasn't an oversight. That was a choice. Someone decided it was easier to let the transmission rot in a cabinet than confront the truth. The operator's face came back to me, fresh out of training. Nervous, eager to do the job right. He died in a car crash. A year later, off duty, no suspicion of foul play. At least that's what the report had said. I wondered, reading that line, if he'd known too much, or if I was just seeing ghosts again. The warning could have saved us from years of blind loyalty. Instead, it was buried, and I was left staring at the evidence decades too late. Too late. That should have been dismissed as a clerical error. But the silence in that file told me it wasn't. Retirement had made me invisible. I could walk into Langley and barely get a nod from the young analysts hustling down the halls. The building hadn't changed much, same cold marble floors, same stale coffee smell, but the faces had. I wasn't there for nostalgia. I was there to chase a name. The initials had authorized the burn order in Berlin. Every page, every flame, carried that signature dot. An old colleague agreed to meet me in a side office, far from the polished conference rooms. He looked worse than I did, red eyes, whiskey breath, tie undone like it hadn't been fixed in years. We didn't waste time on greetings. I slid the copy of the signature across the desk. Who? He stared at it for a long time, then poured 2 drinks from a half-empty bottle. His hand trembled, but his voice didn't. Not one of ours. He said, "That order came from across the river." "The FBI?" I asked. He nodded. "Correct." The room felt smaller after that. We'd always believed our wars were internal Langley politics, Pentagon games, State Department cover-ups. But to hear that the Bureau had sent the command, bypassing our chain entirely, was worse. It meant the purge in Berlin wasn't just about protecting assets overseas. It was about control here. At home, my colleague kept drinking, words loosening with each glass. They wanted it erased. All of it. Not for Moscow. For us. Too many names tied to things nobody could explain. Senators, contractors, even our own. People. Burn it all. Denied ever existed. You think Berlin was about the wall? It wasn't. It was about making sure when the dust settled, no one could point a finger. I asked him if he'd signed off too. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence told me everything. He leaned in, voice raw. We didn't lose to Moscow. We lost to ourselves. They just made sure the files wouldn't prove it. We sat there, the bottle nearly empty, the past pressing down heavier than the whiskey. I wanted to be angry. Instead, I felt tired. Of carrying the weight of secrets that weren't mine to keep, yet were branded on me all the same. I left him slumped at the desk, the copy of the signature still under his glass, the ring of liquor bleeding into the ink. Walking out of Langley that night, I understood something I'd spent years avoiding. The fire in Berlin hadn't been about the Cold War. It had been about burying the truth where, even we couldn't find it again. That should have given me closure. Instead, it only deepened the question. If the Bureau had ordered the burn, what else had we carried out without knowing whose war we were fighting? Berlin, 1972. The assignment sounded simple. Install a listening system inside a Soviet residence. In Karlshorst. We'd done it before bugging apartments, wiring embassies, planting microphones and telephones. This time it was supposed to be routine. A cover team staged a plumbing repair while we worked in the crawl space behind the walls. Tight quarters, dust choking our lungs, a steady thrum of Soviet radios bleeding through the plaster. We set the equipment, tested the line, and walked out without a trace. For a week, it worked. Snippets of chatter, meetings recorded, the kind of intel that justified the budget. Then suddenly silence. The feed went dead, caught clean. Within hours, Moscow had issued a formal protest, accusing Washington of cowboy sabotage. That was their way of letting us know they'd found it. Inside the station, panic spread fast. Someone had tipped them off. Protocol demanded we investigate our own. Suspicion landed on a technician young, eager, not well liked. He'd been responsible for calibrating the line. The logic was easy. He must have slipped. A week later, he was gone. Suicide, they said. Pills. The case was closed before the dirt settled, but the file I held years later said something different. Buried in the appendix of 47B was a note. Leak originated within station. Technician used as cover. Source not disclosed. I read that line over and over, feeling the same weight I'd felt in that crawl space when the equipment hummed alive. We hadn't been protecting the mission. We'd been protecting someone else. I thought about the technicians. Face nervous smile, hands that shook when he signed the logbooks. I'd believed the story back then. Hell, I'd helped spread it. Now, the truth bled through the paper. He'd been collateral, chosen because he was disposable, because the real traitor was still inside those walls. What haunted me wasn't that someone had betrayed us. Betrayal was currency in Berlin. What haunted me was that someone high enough had decided who would pay for it. and that decision was written off as necessary before anyone asked questions. I closed the folder and stared at the wall of my kitchen, the silence ringing louder than any recording. That operation had never left me, not because of what we lost, but because of how easily we'd buried a man to keep the machinery running. That should have been another forgotten failure in a city full of them. But the file proved it had never been failure at all. It had been policy that by 1994, Berlin felt like another planet. The wall was gone, the city buzzing with construction, coffee shops replacing checkpoints. Tourists took pictures where people once bled. I returned as a civilian, carrying no badge, no orders, just questions. Curiosity had grown heavier with the years, and one place in particular kept tugging at me. The old American embassy. The building stood abandoned, its windows bricked over, the courtyard littered with weeds. I walked in through a side entrance we'd used decades earlier, a passage hidden behind a false wall we'd built ourselves. Dust thickened the air, floorboards groaned under my shoes. Every step sounded like trespass. The file had mentioned it, an installation, a cache, something left unfinished. I pushed past collapsed drywall until I found it, a hollow panel, exactly where I remembered. Behind it, wrapped in cloth stiff with age, was a recorder, the kind we used for room sweeps, reel-to-reel, heavy in the hands. My fingers trembled, brushing the dust off, not because I'd found it, but because it was still there. I carried it to a corner, propped it against a crate, and pressed play. Static cracked, reels spun reluctantly, and then a voice emerged. My voice. Calm, measured, speaking phrases I didn't remember ever saying. Coordinates, schedules, code names I'd seen only in red ink briefings. I sat frozen, listening to myself. Betray operations I hadn't even known about. The cadence was unmistakable. Not a tape spliced together. My voice in full sentences, unbroken, as if I'd sat down willingly and dictated it all. For a moment, I thought of hypnosis, coercion, drugged confessions. We'd whispered about those tricks, but I'd never believed them. Hearing myself describe things I never lived broke something inside me. The tape ended abruptly, a click echoing in the hollow room. I rewound it, listened again, desperate to catch a flaw. None, just me, sounding younger, colder, certain. The silence that followed was worse than the recording. I left the embassy with the recorder wrapped under my coat, the city outside louder than it had ever been. Children laughed, cars honked, hammers struck steel. But inside my head, it was only my voice, whispering betrayals I couldn't explain. That should have been proof of forgery, a trick I could dismiss. But the weight of my own words told me otherwise. The deeper I went into 47B, the clearer it became that Sniper wasn't a man at all. He was a system of protocol. The pages described it in bureaucratic language, the kind that hides knives behind. Polite words, cross-asset redundancy, layered loyalty framework. In plain terms, it meant a network of agents built to betray each other on command. I thought back to Warsaw, to that handshake, to the woman in the white coat, to the technician who had died with blame pinned on him. Suddenly, they weren't isolated memories. They were threads of the same net. Sniper wasn't a coding name for a double agent. It was the label for a machine that fed on its own people. The design was cruelly elegant. Each operative believed they were handling a compromised contact. Each report was written to confirm suspicion. But behind it all, the reports themselves were engineered to ensure that trust collapsed before it had the chance to form. We weren't running agents. We were running mirrors, each reflecting the other, until no one could tell who was real. Reading it, I felt sick. Because in the margins, I saw familiar notations phrases from my own field reports, recycled, twisted, used to validate lies. Without knowing, I had become part of the loop. My handwriting, my words, stitched into the machinery of Sniper. Brilliance of it was its invisibility. Agents burned out, disappeared, or turned on one another, and the system stayed intact. No single name, no single person to blame. Just Sniper, the ghost protocol that survived every purge. I remembered the embassy tape, the sound of my own voice, betraying operations. Maybe it hadn't been forgery. Maybe I'd been caught in the gears, my reports rewritten, my voice fed back into the system to keep the illusion alive. If Sniper was never a man, then I had been Sniper too, without knowing it. That realization burned worse than the furnace in Dahlem. For decades, I thought loyalty had weight, that betrayal was a choice, but the file showed me otherwise. Betrayal was baked into the architecture. None of us had been loyal. None of us had been traitors. We were just moving parts in a mechanism, designed to eat itself. I closed the folder and sat in the dark, the word echoing in my head. Protocol. Not person. Not story. A system. And the sickest part was this: I had carried it with me all along. That should have given me clarity. Instead, it left me staring at the truth I didn't want to face. I was never outside of Sniper. I was inside it. The last pages of 47B were thinner, stapled clumsily, as if someone had added them in a hurry. Inside was a single list. No explanations, no cover sheets, just names typed in faded ink. At the top, elimination due to structural risk. I scanned down, line after line, until my eyes froze. My name, not an alias, not a Cody name. My real name sitting there like it belonged, next to others I knew, agents, analysts, even a diplomat who'd vanished in '78. I stared at it so long the letters seemed to blur. The meaning was clear. At some point, someone had decided I was a liability. Not for Moscow, not for Berlin, for my own side. And yet, I was still alive. Which meant only one thing. Someone had crossed it out, silently, without telling me. That thought cut deeper than any betrayal. Someone, somewhere, had judged me expendable. And someone else had disagreed. I remember nights when my assignments changed suddenly, flights rerouted, meetings canceled without explanation. At the time, I'd chalked it up to bureaucracy. Now I wondered if those had been close calls moments. When the list nearly caught up with me, the other names felt heavier now. Men I'd shaken hands with, women who'd passed me files in alleys, faces I hadn't thought about in decades. How many of them had made it off the list? How many had simply stopped appearing? I pressed my hand against the paper, half expecting the ink to smear, as if that would prove it false. It didn't. The list was real. My presence on it was real. And my survival wasn't an accident. Someone had decided I wasn't meant to burn. The question that lodged in my chest was worse than fear. Why? That should have been a moment of gratitude, relief even. But instead, it felt like standing at the edge of a grave someone else had dug for me and never filled. I carried the list folded inside my jacket like a second skin. Weeks passed before I decided to confront someone about it. There weren't many left I could trust. Hell, trust was a word that had lost its meaning, but one name stood out. My old friend, the one who'd shared cigarettes with me on rooftops during stackouts, who'd vouched for me when Langley questioned a botched handoff in '74. Now he was a polished politician, shaking hands in front of cameras, his past scrubbed clean. We met in his office, mahogany desk, flag in the corner, the whole performance. I dropped the list in front of him. He didn't blink. He read it, scanned the names, and slid it back toward me like it was a menu he'd already memorized. "Never seen it," he said flatly. I leaned in, my voice low. "Then explain why my name's on it." He looked me dead in the eye and repeated, "Never seen it." The kind of denial that's too calm, too rehearsed. I almost let it go. Almost. But then I said her name, the woman in the white coat, and everything changed. He didn't flinch, didn't stammer. He went silent. Completely. Still, as if the air had been sucked out of the room. That silence told me more than words ever could. He knew. He knew her, knew the truth behind her ghost, knew why she kept appearing in files that said she was dead. I waited. He said nothing. Not a word, not a gesture. Just the kind of silence you only hear when someone is deciding whether you'll walk. Out alive. I left without pressing further. No threats, no ultimatums. Just the weight of that silence echoing in my ears long after the office door closed behind me. That should have given me answers. Instead, it left me with the certainty that the ones we called the good guys had been writing the script all along and erasing the names that didn't fit. Virginia, years later. I sat by the river with the folder on my lap, the last remnants of 47B reduced to brittle ash inside a metal tin. The water moved slow, brown with silt, carrying branches and leaves like it didn't care what history they came from. I opened the tin, let the wind catch the flakes, and watched them scatter. Pages that had outlived a war, a wall, and even, gone in seconds. The truth wasn't in the documents. It never had been. The truth was in why they wanted them burned, why some names were erased, why others, like mine, were spared. What we carried wasn't intelligence. It was permission. Permission to forget, to lie, to keep playing a game no one ever intended to win. I lit a cigarette, the smoke mixing with the ash drifting downstream. For the first time in years, I felt nothing. Just the silence. That should have been enough. But the silence never really ends. If you stayed with me through this story, give it a like, subscribe.